Ever feel like your past relationships are holding you back? You know, like you're dragging this invisible suitcase full of baggage everywhere you go.
Yeah, totally.
Well, what if I told you you could unpack that baggage and actually use it to like build stronger, healthier relationships, not just romantic ones, but with everyone?
Sounds intriguing.
It is. It's the premise behind It Begins With You by relationship coach and podcast host Jillian Tarecki.
Okay, cool.
And if you're interested in diving deeper on relationships, I definitely recommend checking out Tarecki's podcast too. It's called Jillian on Love.
Check it out.
Awesome. But for this deep dive, we're going to unpack 9 core truths from her book.
9.
Yep. 9 core truths that can totally change how you approach relationships.
Okay, I'm ready. What's the first truth?
All right. So the first one that really stood out to me was how Tarecki emphasizes personal responsibility.
Okay.
She doesn't let us off the hook by just blaming our relationship problems on other people.
Right.
Instead, she highlights how every single relationship we have has one thing in common.
What's that?
Us.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And it reminds me of this story about Jennifer, one of Tarecki's clients.
Oh, okay.
She kept finding herself in these toxic relationships over and over again.
Oh, no.
But Jennifer really resisted the idea that she had any part in attracting these partners.
That's interesting. A lot of people probably feel that way.
Yeah, it's easier to blame others than look inward, right?
Right.
Probably. But Tarecki helped Jennifer break free from that cycle by really getting her to focus on self-awareness and taking responsibility for her own choices.
So, like, she helped her see her own patterns.
Exactly. And you know what's really inspiring about Jennifer's story? She got to this point where she realized that being alone was actually healthier than staying in a relationship that was just draining her.
Wow.
That takes courage.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, how many people stay in relationships even when they know they shouldn't.
That's a good point. And it leads us perfectly into Tarecki's next truth, the idea of true self-care.
Okay. I'm intrigued. I love the idea of self-care.
Me too. She actually has a really unique approach to it, drawing on her background as a yoga teacher.
Oh, cool. Does she talk about specific poses or something?
Well, she goes beyond just the typical bubble baths and face masks, Like she really digs into what it means to actually nurture yourself on a deeper level.
I like that. More than just surface level stuff.
Totally. And she emphasizes 4 key elements.
Oh, what are they?
Movement, nature, play, and rest.
Those all sound really important.
Yeah. And the play part really stood out to me.
We play, like as adults.
Yeah. I think a lot of us as adults, we just forget how to be playful.
That's true.
And Tarecki highlights how important it is to be childlike.
Childlike, okay.
Open, curious, silly, but not childish. There's a difference. It's about tapping into that sense of wonder and joy. The stuff we often lose sight of as we get older.
Yeah, I get that. I think we get so caught up in the seriousness of adulting sometimes.
Totally. And she uses this great example. She talks about Kelly, one of her clients. Kelly was like the ultimate superwoman, constantly juggling a million things and always feeling totally overwhelmed.
I've been there.
Right. And she expected her partner to magically fix her stress.
That's a recipe for disaster, probably.
Exactly. Which, of course, led to a lot of resentment and conflict in their relationship.
It's so easy to fall into that trap thinking our partners should just know what we need.
Right. And it makes you think, who are we putting that pressure on to fix our stress?
Yeah, good question. So what did Tarecki recommend?
Well, she emphasized the importance of clear communication and setting healthy boundaries.
That makes sense. So speaking of communication, I'm curious about how Tarecki addresses that.
Well, that leads us perfectly to the concept of the monkey mind.
Monkey mind.
Yeah. It's what Tarecki dives into in her third truth. It's this idea that our minds are constantly creating stories, especially about our relationships. And a lot of times, those stories are based on fear or insecurity or past hurts.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like my mind is this little drama factory just churning out worst case scenarios 24/7. Right.
That's so true.
To illustrate this, she uses the example of Sarah, another client, who is completely convinced her boyfriend broke up with her because he didn't want kids.
Oh, wow. Heartbreak.
Right. But after they explored it together, they discovered that the breakup was actually a result of irreconcilable differences, not a lack of love at all.
So Sarah's monkey mind had created this whole narrative that wasn't entirely accurate.
That's exactly it. And it's so easy to jump to those conclusions, especially when we're feeling hurt or vulnerable.
I've definitely been there. It's hard to be objective when you're in the middle of a painful situation.
It really is. But thankfully, Tarecki provides some really practical techniques for taming that monkey mind. ways to challenge those negative thought patterns.
Okay, so there's hope for us.
Definitely. And this leads us to the next truth, which is all about that undeniable spark, that chemistry that can make us feel so alive.
Ooh, chemistry. That's always a tricky one. Right. Tarecki actually shares a personal story about falling head over heels for a guy she met at, get this, a yoga studio.
No way, at a yoga studio.
Yeah. The chemistry was super intense, but she ended up ignoring some pretty big red flags because she was so caught up in that initial attraction.
It's a powerful reminder that chemistry can be incredibly misleading.
Like those warning signs you see on a winding road. You know you should slow down, but the thrill of the ride can make you just ignore them.
Totally. It sounds like Tarecki is making a distinction between lust and genuine connection.
Exactly. That initial rush of attraction versus a deeper connection that takes time and effort to build. And that leads perfectly into her next truth, which focuses on a client named Jade.
Okay, tell me about Jade.
Jade was hiding behind this mask, literally and figuratively. She was afraid to show her true self, so she relied on makeup and designer clothes to create this persona that she thought was more acceptable.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, right? We all wear masks to some extent. It's like we're trying to protect ourselves from rejection or judgment.
For sure. And Tarecki gave Jade some pretty unconventional directives to break free from this. She actually challenged her to go out in public without her usual armor.
Really? Like what?
No makeup, casual clothes, the whole bit.
Wow, that's bold.
Yeah. It's about having the courage to reveal your authentic self, to peel back those layers of protection. And guess what?
What happened?
Jade's transformation actually led to a much healthier relationship because she was finally comfortable just being herself.
Makes you wonder what masks we're all wearing, right?
That's the question, isn't it? What are the masks we're wearing and how are they affecting our relationships? Something to think about.
I'm definitely going to be thinking about that.
Me too.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the masks we might be wearing, and how they could be affecting our relationships.
It's so true. And it also makes me think about all the stuff we've been talking about how our own patterns and behaviors affect our relationships. But Tarecki also digs into this other really important aspect, how our childhood experiences, especially with our parents, can shape those patterns.
Oh, yeah, for sure. She doesn't shy away from the tougher stuff either. Like, even sharing her own personal story about growing up with a father who had undiagnosed bipolar disorder, it's pretty raw and honest, a real look at how those early wounds from childhood can show up in our adult relationships.
I think that's something so many people can relate to, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's not always about huge dramatic trauma either. Even little things like, a parent constantly criticizing how we look or comparing us to our siblings, that can have a lasting impact.
Yeah, totally.
Tarecki talks about how those kinds of experiences can make us, without even realizing it, attract partners who mirror those same patterns, even if those patterns aren't healthy for us.
Like we're drawn to what feels familiar, right?
Even if it's painful.
It's almost like our brains are kind of wired to seek out those familiar things, even if they're not good for us. Think about comfort food. Like we crave it when we're feeling down, even though it might not be the healthiest option.
I like that. That's a great analogy.
Thanks. Anyway, Tarecki really emphasizes that just recognizing these patterns is like the first step towards breaking free from them.
Okay.
It's about becoming aware of how our past might be influencing our present relationships.
And that awareness can be really powerful.
Totally. It's like finally seeing things clearly, without those rose-colored glasses.
Exactly. And speaking of seeing things clearly, I think we should talk about one of the biggest relationship hurdles these days.
What's that?
The dreaded situationship.
The situationship. That gray area where you're not quite sure what's going on, but you're definitely emotionally invested.
Right. It's like being stuck in that awkward talking phase for months or even years.
So true. It's exhausting trying to figure out those mixed signals and always wondering, where do I stand?
Tarecki describes it as a state of limbo, where, one person is all in and the other person is hesitant or just unsure about their feelings.
I see what you mean.
And honestly, it can be so draining, emotionally and mentally.
Absolutely. So where do these situationships come from?
Well, a lot of times it's rooted in a fear of commitment. Or maybe a lack of emotional availability on one or both sides. It's like one person is trying to build a house while the other is still figuring out the blueprints.
I love that analogy. It's like you're just not on the same page at all.
Right. And Tarecki really encourages us to be honest with ourselves, brutally honest about what's really happening in our situationships. Asking ourselves those tough questions.
Like
Like, are we settling for crumbs? Are we just holding on to this hope that things will magically change? Those kinds of things.
And sometimes that means we need to walk away, right? Even if it's painful.
It can be tough, for sure. But it's also about, like, recognizing our own worth and refusing to settle for less than we deserve.
I love that. Choosing ourselves.
Right. It's about reclaiming our power, you know, and choosing connections that actually nourish us, not drain us.
Okay, I love that. So we've covered so much. Responsibility, self-care, monkey mind, chemistry, situationships. Is there anything else we need to touch on?
Well, we can't finish this deep dive without talking about the happiness myth. Tarecki spent some time unpacking this idea that, you know, finding the one will magically solve all our problems and make us happy.
That's so funny because we hear that message all the time. It's like those fairy tales we grew up with. You know, find your Prince Charming and you'll live happily ever after.
Yeah, but real life is a little more complicated.
A lot more complicated. So what does she say about it?
Well, Tarecki emphasizes that true happiness is an inside job. It's not something we find out there. It's something we have to cultivate within ourselves.
Like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't expect to find happiness in a relationship if you're not already happy with yourself.
Right. And she even offers some concrete tools for building that inner happiness. Practices like meditation, connecting with nature, moving your body, finding your purpose. It's all about building a strong inner foundation.
So it's like focusing on the structure of a house, not just the pretty decorations. You need a solid base to build on.
Exactly. But even with that foundation, we can still trip over those old patterns and beliefs, you know? Like, it's important to remember what we've been talking about, that our past, especially with our parents, can have a big impact on our romantic lives.
And she doesn't sugarcoat it either. She's pretty direct. She says, if we don't address our childhoods, our romantic relationships will.
Whoa.
It's powerful stuff.
It is. And it might be hard for some people to hear.
True. But there's also freedom in facing that truth, don't you think? Like, it gives us the power to actually change those patterns.
Totally. It's about understanding how our parents' own experiences and like the limitations they had might have shaped the way they parented us, and having compassion for them. And also realizing that like we don't have to just repeat those same cycles.
I get that.
Tarecki shares this story about a client named Gabriella, whose mother used to always tell her, "Girls don't cry."
Wow, that's loaded.
It is. That one little message had a huge impact on Gabriella's ability to express her emotions and connect authentically with people.
It's like she was taught to suppress a fundamental part of herself.
Exactly. But Tarecki helped Gabriella challenge that belief and like reclaim her vulnerability.
So beautiful.
It is. It's a great example of how we can break free from those limiting messages we pick up along the way.
It's inspiring, for sure. So now that we've talked about all of this, what are some key takeaways for listeners to really think about?
Yeah, it is inspiring. And it's amazing how much like those early experiences can shape our relationship patterns. But the biggest takeaway for me is that we actually have the power to change those patterns. That's 100% right. And that actually brings us to what I think might be Tarecki's most important truth, the idea of choosing ourselves.
Choosing ourselves, I like that.
Yeah. And she doesn't just mean basic self-care either. She's talking about something bigger, like recognizing our own inherent worth and then making choices that are aligned with our values and what we truly want.
So like setting boundaries, saying no when you need to, really prioritizing your own well-being.
Exactly. That's it. And I know it can be tough, especially if we're like used to putting everyone else's needs before our own.
It's hard to break those habits.
Yeah, it can be. But Tarecki really emphasizes that choosing ourselves is not selfish. In fact, it's like the foundation for having really healthy, fulfilling relationships.
That makes sense. If you're more secure in yourself, then you can show up for others with more love and compassion and understanding.
It's true. You know, think about that oxygen mask on an airplane. They always tell you, put your own mask on first before you try to help anyone else.
Right. That's a perfect analogy. And setting boundaries is a huge part of choosing ourselves too, right?
Absolutely. Boundaries are so important in any healthy relationship. They're like that fence around your house.
Okay.
They define your personal space and they protect your well-being.
And it's not about being mean or controlling either, is it?
No, not at all. It's about communicating your needs and your limits clearly, but respectfully.
Right. It's saying, hey, this is what I'm okay with, and this is where I draw the line, and then actually honoring those boundaries even when it's hard.
That can be the hardest part.
Yeah. But when we respect our own boundaries, it teaches other people to respect them too.
I think that's right. Okay, now another super important point that Tarecki brings up is that we can't actually convince anyone to love us.
It's a hard truth, but it's so freeing when you actually accept it.
It is freeing, you know? I think a lot of us get caught up in trying to control how others feel about us, but Tarecki reminds us to let go of that. We just can't force someone to feel a certain way no matter how hard we try.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. It's just not going to work.
Right.
And even if a relationship ends, it doesn't mean we're unlovable or not worthy.
Exactly. Sometimes it just means you're incompatible or you're on different paths. And honestly, sometimes ending a relationship can actually be an act of self-love.
Right. It's like opening up space for something new and better to come into your life.
Yeah, like pruning a garden.
Yeah.
Got to cut away those dead branches to make room for new growth.
Love that.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about Amanda, one of Tarecki's clients. She was stuck in this situationship with a guy who was going through a divorce. And, she kept hoping that he would choose her eventually if she was just patient enough and supportive enough.
And in the meantime, she was sacrificing her own needs and ignoring all these red flags.
Classic people pleaser, maybe.
Yeah, could be. Anyway, Tarecki helped Amanda realize that she was kind of playing the role of the healer, always drawn to men who needed rescuing.
It's a common pattern, right? Like trying to fix or save other people as a way of avoiding our own pain. It's like trying to heal someone else's wounds with your own Band-Aids.
You got it. It's not going to work. So Tarecki encouraged Amanda to switch gears, focus on healing her own wounds instead of trying to fix someone else's. It's a powerful reminder that we can't truly love and support other people until we've done the work on ourselves.
And it all circles back to that core message of the book. It all begins with you. So as we wrap up this deep dive into It Begins With You, I want to leave you with one last thought. What's one tiny action you can take today to start improving that most important relationship, the one with yourself?
Maybe it's setting a small boundary. Maybe it's practicing self-compassion. Or maybe it's just taking 5 minutes to connect with your breath. Whatever it is, even the smallest steps can lead to some pretty big changes.
Well said. And if you're ready to go even deeper into Jillian Tarecki's work, definitely check out her book, It Begins With You, and her podcast, Jillian on Love. You'll find some amazing insights and practical tools to help you navigate this crazy world of relationships. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep choosing yourselves.